Today we are going to be reading a book called Who Was George Washington? By Roberta Edwards, illustrated by True Kelly. Who was George Washington? 1783. After 7 long years of fighting, the war was finally over. American soldiers had beaten the mighty British Army. The 13 colonies were independent now. Ships full of British soldiers sailed back to England. From here on in, nobody in America had to obey King George. There were going to be a brand new country with 13 United States. And in 1789, when it came time to elect the first president, who was the number one choice? George Washington, of course. George Washington had been the top general throughout the war. He was not the kind of general who just gave orders and then watched soldiers do the fighting. He was often in the thick of battle. Yet Washington was never wounded, not once. Besides being brave, he was also smart, loyal, honest, and fair. Everything a leader should be. Would the war have been won without him? Maybe people didn't think so. It was no surprise that he won the first election for president, but when he learned the news, he was not happy. Oh no, he wasn't happy at all. He loved being back in Virginia at Mount Vernon, his beautiful home. He was 15 years old and hoped to spend the rest of his life there with his wife Martha and her 2 youngest grandchildren. As the very first president, so much would be expected of him, and strange as it may seem to us, George Washington worried that he wasn't up to the job. No, the job of president was not at all to his liking, but many people said that they would only support the new government if George Washington were president, and more than anything, he wanted the new government to work. So he said yes and started off for New York, where he would take the oath of office. At every stop along the way, there were parties and parades for him, just what George didn't want. Today, politicians may spend years planning to run for president. Millions of dollars are spent on campaigns, yet the man who is known as the father of our country felt like a criminal going off to his execution. All he wanted was to stay home and go fox hunting. Chapter 1. A Boy from Virginia. On the night of February 22nd, 1732, Augustine Washington sat at a table by candlelight. A family Bible lay open before him. Gus, and everyone called him, was a tobacco farmer in the colony of Virginia, with a pen made from the quill of a turkey. He wrote down the name of his son, George, who had been born that very morning. George's mother, Mary, was Gus's second wife. His first wife had died, leaving him with 2 teenage sons. One night, not long before George was born, a bolt of lightning shot down the chimney of the Washingtons' farmhouse. It killed a woman who was visiting Mary. Mary worried that the lightning was a sign of bad luck. It might mean that there'd be something wrong with her baby, but George was a strong, healthy baby. People said he looked like his mother. He grew into a tall, athletic boy who loved to ride horses through the green countryside. In later years, he was known as the best horseman in Virginia. When George was about 7, the family moved to Ferry Farm. It was across the river from Fredericksburg, Virginia. By the time George had a younger sister, Betty, and 3 younger brothers, Samuel, John, and Charles, people said George and Betty looked a lot alike. As a grown woman, she would be a funny imitations of her famous brother. There isn't any information about how George and his father got along, but we do know he wasn't close to his mother. Mary Washington was a cold, bossy woman. All George's friends were scared of her. Strangely, she never took pride in her oldest son. Not even after he became president, his letter to her would be, "Honored Madam," instead of "Dear Mother." And he never introduced his wife, Martha, to her. The person he loved best in the world was his kind half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was Gus's oldest son. He was 14 years old than George. Lawrence had gone to school in England. He had learned Greek and Latin. He knew how to dress like a gentleman and act like a gentleman. There wasn't enough money to send George off to England. Instead, he was taught at home, probably by his father and Lawrence. George was great at math, anything with numbers. Anything with numbers came easily to him, but he was a terrible speller. It embarrassed him his entire life. When George was only 11, his father died. From time to time, George was invited for long visits to Mount Vernon. This was a home of Lawrence and his new bride, Anne Fairfax. George loved it there. In 1746, George asked to move in for good, and off he went. He probably was happy, too, to get away from his mother. Chapter 2. Mount Vernon. At Mount Vernon, a whole new world opened up for George. Now he mixed up the richest families in Virginia. He went fox hunting and to fancy balls. Shy and a little awkward, George wanted to fit in very badly, so he took dancing lessons. In time, he became an excellent dancer. George took fencing lessons and learned about music. He wore nicer clothes. He also wrote himself a long list of rules about good manners. One of the rules was about not spitting into a fire while meat was being cooked in it. Another rule was to avoid killing fleas and lice in the presence of other people. Lawrence's in-laws, the Fairfaxes, were one of the richest families in Virginia. They owned huge tracts of land. There were no maps yet of the west part of the colony, so people often hired surveyors. A surveyor's job was to measure and mark property boundaries. It was the perfect job for George. He loved the outdoors. He was quick at math and needed to earn money. Besides no maps, there was no roads in western Virginia. It was wilderness, so as surveyor George lived a rough life. For weeks on end, he'd wear the same clothes, sleep on the ground along with other hired men, cook over an open fire, and try to steer clear of hostile bands of Indians. George grew up to be a broad-shouldered young man with clear blue-gray eyes and reddish-brown hair. He wore it in a ponytail. At 6'2", he was often the tallest person in a group. His hands and feet were huge, except his bad teeth. He was in excellent health. Lawrence, unfortunately, had much more serious health problems. He developed a terrible cough. In the hope that warm weather might be good for his brother, George and Lawrence sailed to the island of Barbados, off Venezuela. It was George Washington's first and only trip outside North America. Sadly, Lawrence's health did not improve, and George came down with smallpox, another deadly disease. George survived. Lawrence, however, died in 1752, with George at his bedside. It was a terrible blow for George. He was only 20, and he lost the person he loved most. George Washington not only loved Lawrence, he respected him. Lawrence had been an officer in the militia. A militia is a group of part-time soldiers who were not part of a regular army. Now, Lawrence's post was open. George took his brother's place. Chapter 3. A Young Soldier. It was the early 1750s for the most time. France and England had been fighting over land in the Ohio River Valley. The problem was simple. Both countries wanted to control it. The French built many forts in the area. They wanted to keep British colonists hemmed in on the East Coast. George Washington was sent to deliver a warning to the French. Abandon the forts at once. The French ignored the message. Still, the trip was an important one for George. Along with a small band of men, he traveled through 1,000 miles of wilderness. He crossed 2 ranges of mountains. He got thrown off a crude raft in an icy river. The water was so cold, his clothes froze solid. Yet he made it home safely and was promoted for his bravery. He wrote a journal about his travels that appeared in a newspaper. The Journal of Major George Washington made him famous. A few months later, he was sent back to the Ohio River Valley. This time, there were more than 150 men with him. They were to build a fort. The French and British were not openly at war, but when Washington's men came up, French soldiers a shot range out. Which side began the attack? To this day, no one is sure who started it. But while Washington lost 9 of his men, 10 French soldiers ended up dead. Among them was their leader. That was all it took to spark a real war between the French and British. Soon, 800 French soldiers, along with 400 Indians, attacked Washington's much smaller army. 100 of his men died. What choice did he have except to surrender? He and his men were not taken prisoner. Instead, they had been abandoned their forts and were to return home. For George, the defeat was a big blow. All his life, he had been concerned about his image. He wanted to appear brave, honorable. To surrender was embarrassing. Yet once again, he was praised for his leadership. His career as a soldier was taking off. Next, he became the aide of the British general in charge of chasing out the French from Ohio Valley. Up to now, Washington had to lead American soldiers. Now he was to serve alongside the tough, fearsome redcoats. This was the nickname for the soldiers in the British Army because of the bright red coats they wore. The general assembled a mighty force of 2,000 men to attack one of the largest French forts. In Europe, enemy armies met face to face in open fields. Line after line of troops would march straight toward one another, firing cannons and muskets. Washington warned the British general that fighting was done differently in America. The enemy would come at the redcoats from all sides. The French and Indians would attack from the woods. They would stay hidden behind trees and rocks. The general refused to listen. The redcoats were to attack as they had been trained to. The result was a crushing disaster for the British. Soldiers on horseback were mowed down by hidden French and Indian forces. Soon, hundreds of redcoats lay dead. As for Washington, 4 musket shots tore through his coats. His hat was shot off with his head. His hat shot off his head. 2 horses were shot from under him, yet he was never hit. The general was not so lucky. He died from a battle wound, so George Washington took command of all frontier forces. He was only 22 years old. For 5 years, he helped build more than 88 forts in the Ohio River Valley. For 5 years, he fought against French troops as well as a hostile bands of Indians. In the end, the British won what became known as the French and Indian War. Colonists were now free to move west and settle to the rich lands of the Ohio River Valley. Chapter 4. Country Life. George had seen enough of war. He gave up his command and returned to Virginia. His brother Lawrence's wife had died. She had no living children. So Mount Vernon now belonged to George. He intended to live there peacefully for the rest of his life. At a dance, George met a very rich young widow with 2 young children. Her name was Martha Custis. She was short and plump with a warm smile. She knew the same people George knew. They both wanted the same kind of country life. In all ways, it was a good match. I have found an agreeable partner, he wrote to a friend. On January 6, 1759, they were married. They both were 27 years old. Although never wildly in love, there was a strong bond between them. Martha called George old man or papa suddenly. They had no children together, but they doted upon little Pasty as her older brother Jackie. Both George and Martha loved to entertain. When he was a much older man, he claimed he and Martha hadn't dined alone in 20 years. Nearly every week, company stayed over at Mount Vernon. Washington was a most considerate host. One guest with a bad cold reported waking up at night. There in the room stood George Washington with a hot cup of tea for him. 2 or 3 weeks at a time, Washington went fox hunting. One of his hunting dogs was named Sweetlips. He liked to play cards and gamble for small sums of money. He'd meet up with friends at a local tavern to hear the latest gossip and jokes, but running a large farm was serious business. It took up almost all of his time. Washington rose early and had tea and pancakes with honey for breakfast. The pancakes were cut into small slices, which made it easier for him to eat. Then he would get on the horse and cover all 4 corners of his farmland. He helped drive in cattle and mend fences. At first, the farm raised and sold tobacco. Tobacco was very difficult to grow, even though Washington experimented with ways to improve his crop. Later he switched to grow wheat and built a mill to turn the wheat into flour. Wheat was much easier to grow, and he could sell it locally, whereas most of the tobacco was shipped to England. There were no grocery stores or clothing stores in the Virginia countryside. Expensive things like carriages and fancy clothing were shipped over from England. Almost everything else was grown or made in the farm. Linen from clothes was spun and woven there. Wool came from Mount Vernon sheep. At Mount Vernon, there were many people to feed and clothe. Between them, George and Martha owned as many as 300 slaves. Like other rich farmers in the South, Washington had slaves grow his crops and work his fields. Later in life, he began to see slavery for what it was: evil, cruel, and unjust. But for a long time, he accepted slavery as just the way things were. He was neither a very harsh nor very kind master. During his 14 years as a farmer, George Washington was also elected a member of Virginia Houses of Burgesses. Burgesses were men who met in Williamsburg. It was the capital of the colony then. They voted on local issues. Even though the 13 colonies belonged to England, they had some form of self-government. As long as the king and parliament, the government of England, acted in the colonists' interests, it was a pretty good arrangement. Most colonists were proud to be British subjects. Then in 1760, the situation changed. Chapter 5, Breaking Away. The long French and Indian War had been very costly for England. The king, George II, had borrowed a lot of money. The war had been fought on American soil. Even after England won, an army of 10,000 redcoats remained in America in case the French acted up again. In 1763, the king's grandson, George III, took the throne. The new king thought it was only fair for the colonies to pay for the war expenses. Where would the money come from? Taxes. In 1765, the English Parliament passed the Stamp Act. In the colonies, all kinds of documents and paper goods suddenly had to carry a stamp on them. Wills, contracts, college diplomas, and marriage licenses weren't valid without the stamp. Newspapers and playing cards had to be stamped, too. The stamp didn't cost much, but the colonists were furious. It was the one thing for their own local governments to pass new taxes. Local governments were made up of men elected by the colonists, but Parliament was 3,000 miles away. Colonists had no power there. They hadn't elected any of the members of Parliament, nor could they vote them out of office. What seemed fair to the king and to the Parliament on the one side of the Atlantic seemed totally unfair to the colonists in America. Where did George Washington stand on the Stamp Act? He thought it was wrong, but he didn't join in the protest. Parliament ended the Stamp Act in 1766 because so many angry colonists had stopped buying British goods. It was hurting trade. But the very next year, Parliament forced colonists to pay taxes on paper, paint, glass, lead, and tea. All these items were imported from England. Once again, protests in America brought about the repeal, the end of the taxes, all except for one, the tax on tea. The tax on tea may not seem important, but tea was a very popular drink in the colonies. People often drank 15 cups a day. Taxing tea made everyone mad, including George Washington. Rather than paying the tea tax, he switched to coffee. The latest round of taxes changed his feelings about being an English subject. He thought Parliament's control of the colonies was unjust. It had to stop. He wrote to a friend that colonists should not hesitate to use arms to defend their rights. Before the waves of taxes, the 13 colonies had little in common with one another. Each colony considered itself a separate land with its own separate interests. Now, anger over taxes brought the colonies together. It united them. England cracked down on Boston after the Tea Party. The harbor was closed. The local government was shut down. British troops moved in. No goods could come in or go out of the city. Businesses came to a halt. Food was scarce. Still, the citizens refused to pay for their ruined tea. After all, they had only been standing up for their rights. People in other colonies sided with Boston, including George Washington. That summer, a meeting among the colonies took place in Philadelphia. George Washington was one of the 6 men from Virginia who attended. The Continental Congress, as it was called, represented 12 of the colonies. Georgia decided not to come. Nobody talked about breaking away from England, not yet. They still hoped the situation would improve. But by the time the Second Continental Congress met in May 1775, mood had changed greatly. Fighting had already broken out between colonists and redcoats in a few Massachusetts towns. Americans had died. There was no turning back now. The colonies wanted to independence. The Second Continental Congress began to prepare for war. George Washington had arrived in his blue soldier's jacket. He was 43 now. He had been a farmer for the past 15 years. As for his early war record, it was not great. He never won a field battle or he ever commanded a large army. Nevertheless, in June 1775, he was asked to lead the brand new Continental Army. He said yes, though he had serious doubts as to his abilities. His first reaction was to turn bright red, and then he ran out of the meeting. Chapter 6. The Commanding General. The War for Independence lasted from 1775 to 1783. Of course, everyone knows how it ended. The colonists won the war. To us, it doesn't seem as if it could have happened any other way. But during the war, no one could be sure of the outcome. In fact, it seemed as though the colonists had very little chance against England. The Continental Army that Washington led went into the war with no training. Soldiers were young, poor, and uneducated. Most were between 15 and 25 years old. Most joined the army because few other choices were open to them. They wanted the pay. There were never enough soldiers. The living conditions were terrible. In fact, more American soldiers were killed by smallpox and any other diseases. There often wasn't enough ammunition, or food, or clothes. Soldiers went months without pay. And as the war dragged on the year after year, George Washington found it harder and harder to get money for his army's needs. Compared to British generals, George Washington knew little about waging war. Before taking command of his troops, he bought 5 books on military tactics. Indeed, out of 9 battles he fought in, he only won 3. The enemy he faced was a mighty British army. It was the biggest and best trained fighting machine in the world. The British Navy owned the seas. British generals and admirals were brave and war-tested. So how, against all odds, did Americans win? One reason is that they simply stuck it out. The longer the Continental Army hung in the war, the more likely it became at some point, the British would give up. In a way, the Americans didn't have to win. They just couldn't lose. Over time, Washington became a Schwelder general. He came to see that short surprise strikes against the enemy were better than staggering big battles. This wasn't considered a gentlemanly way to fight. But surprise attacks paid off. The Continental Army was fighting for a cause. Americans wanted independence and were willing to die for it. They were also fighting on home turf. British soldiers, on the other hand, were in a strange place, 3,000 miles from home. They were fighting only because it was their job. In 1778, the French decided to help the Americans. Britain, after all, was France's longest-time enemy. Besides money and ships, the French sent troops. Among them was a brave young nobleman, the Marquis de la Fuente. He became one of George Washington's closest, most trusted aides. He was almost like a son to Washington. In 1778, a man arrived at the Army's winter quarters in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. He said he was a German general and called himself von Steuben. He wasn't a general or a baron, but he had been a soldier since he was 16. He knew all about training soldiers. Von Steuben taught Washington's men how to work as a unit. He taught them how to keep fighting even though they were afraid, even though friends were dying around them. Because of the Baron, the Continental Army became much more professional. That helped them win the war. Perhaps more important than anything else, George Washington was the reason for victory. Despite defeats, common soldiers always had faith in him. During the Long War, 4 British commanding generals came and went. For the Americans, there was only one, Washington. To everyone, he was known as His Excellency. Quite an aloft. He was not chummy with his soldiers. He did not joke with them, but he always treated them with respect. He was a natural-born leader, and his men felt tremendously loyal to him. At times, Washington seemed almost superhuman. He never showed fear. The horror of war never affected his health or his outer calm. He'd play catch with his aides to relieve stress. Instead, the pressure must have been tremendous. Men's lives were in his hands, and not just on the battlefield. One never-ending problem was George Washington not being able to clothe and feed his soldiers properly. The Congress in Philadelphia didn't have the power to supply money or send more troops, and local government in the colony weren't eager to raise taxes to fund what had become a very long war. Washington saw the bigger picture. Yes, this was a war for independence, but if the colonies won freedom from England, what would happen then? Washington gave much thought to this all during the war. If a new country was born, he came to believe that it just may be a strong central government. Just as if his army needed a strong commanding officer, Washington believed that a new country made from the different colonies would need a strong leader. Not a king, but an elected leader. Chapter 7. Hard Times. Most of the battles in the war were fought in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In late fall of 1778, the Continental Army won an important victory in Saratoga, New York. After receiving the good news, Washington led 10,000 of his men westward in Pennsylvania. They would set up camp until spring, when battles would resume. He picked a place called Valley Forge. It wasn't easy to defend. Also, his spies could keep an eye on British troops in nearby Philadelphia. The months at Valley Forge should have been a time for the troops to rest up, regain their strength. However, the weather turned bitter cold. The huts the soldiers built had no heat. The snow made all the wood too damp to burn. In letters to command the Continental Congress, Washington kept begging for help. He needed uniforms, shoes, and food. Washington was told to stop his whining complaints. How bad was it for the soldiers? Many were dressed only in rags. Some had no clothes at all, just a tattered blanket. Sometimes a soldier would had to borrow someone else's rags to go on duty. Officers who had shoes poured whiskey in them to prevent frostbite. Common soldiers often went barefoot. Washington reported seeing blood from their feet in the snow. Some soldiers' frozen feet turned black and had to be amputated. There was no food for the horses. Most fell down dead. There wasn't enough food for the soldiers either. They would go for days without even so much as a bite for a meal. They were near starvation. As always, Martha came to stay with her husband and the troops at winter camp. Everyone called her Lady Washington. She couldn't stand the sight of blood and was known for saying that she shuddered at the sound of gunshot. Yet she knew being there meant a lot of soldiers as well as her husband at Valley Forge. She cared for the sick and would leave small gifts for them. Still, a quarter of troops, 2,500, died from disease. What is even more terrible is that the suffering at Valley Forge was unnecessary. Pennsylvania farmers had recently harvested their crops. It had been a very good year. They had supplied the troops with food and clothes, but chose instead to reap bigger profits by selling it to the British. Terrible as time was at Valley Forge, conditions at the winter camp in Morristown the following year was worse. Soldiers were deserting. Sick soldiers were dying in huge numbers. Washington's army was down to 8,000 men. Of those, fewer than 3,000 were well enough to fight. More bad news came to the summer. The city of Charlestown, South Carolina, fell to the British. After that, there was an American defeat in Savannah, Georgia. And then in the fall, Washington learned that Benedict Arnold, a daring and trusted general, had gone over to the British side. Arnold did it for the money, and to this day is considered the worst traitor in American history. Chapter 8, Victory. The Continental Army was in shambles in the spring of 1781, yet only 7 months later the war ended. One battle changed everything. For a long time, George Washington had dreamed of retaking New York City, which had been captured by the British. Washington wanted a big win badly, but wisely, he now focused on victory in the South and Virginia. The British commanding general, Lord Charles Cornwallis, had just moved his entire army to Yorktown, Virginia. It was on a peninsula, which meant his army was surrounded in 3 sides of water. As American ships headed into the area, a fleet of French ships joined them. Then Washington sent 2,000 troops to join forces with French soldiers at the tip of Pennsylvania. All told, Washington had the strength of 21,000 men. Cornwallis had only about 7,000. Cornwallis' army was not only outnumbered, it hemmed in on each side. The British were trapped. The battles began, and on October 17, the 8th day of bombardment, General Cornwallis surrendered. 2 days later, George Washington sat on his favorite horse, Nelson, watching the defeat British soldiers march out of Yorktown. He did not realize right then that his victory spelled the end of the war, but it had. The Americans had won independence. It took 2 years before a treaty between Britain and the United States was signed in Paris, France. As soon as word of the treaty came, Washington said farewell to his army. First, he said goodbye to the ordinary soldiers. He called them a patriotic band of brothers. A month later, he met with his officer in Frank's Tavern in New York City. The tavern is still there. He broke down in tears. Here were men who had stood by him through the long years of war. Each officer stood before him for a handshake and a kiss on the cheek. George Washington resigned from the army. On Christmas Eve, 1783, he arrived home. Martha was there at Mount Vernon to greet him. He planned to take up farming again and spent the rest of his days in Virginia. He was 51 years old. It was time to retire. Chapter 9, A Brand New Country. George Washington was living again in his beloved Virginia. He was still the most famous man in America, just as he had been all through the war. A constant stream of visitors arrived at Mount Vernon. Everyone wanted to meet His Excellency. What brought Washington out of retirement, the country was floundering. The government was weak. It didn't have the power to raise taxes or control trade or mark state boundaries. Washington said it was as clear as to me as the ABC. That the new country needed a much stronger government. In 1787, at a convention held in Philadelphia, the Constitution was written. It mapped out the kind of government George Washington hoped for. There would be 3 branches of power: a president, a Congress to pass laws, and a Supreme Court to rule on whether laws were fair. No branch would have too much power. Even before the first election for president was held, everyone knew George Washington would win. The election system then was different from the way it is now. Electors from the different states were chosen. Each had 2 votes. Everyone voted for Washington, so he became president. John Adams came in second, with 34 votes, so he had become vice president. George Washington received the news on April 14, 1789. 2 days later, he set out for the temporary capital, New York City. There, he would take the oath of office. He said there were no words to express how anxious he felt. He was walking on untrodden ground. He meant there were no path for him to follow, because no one had ever been president before. George Washington was sworn in on a balcony at Federal Hall. He said, I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will be the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Every U.S. president has taken the same oath. No one even knew what to call the president. John Adams suggested His Elective Highness. Others suggested His Mightiness, or Majesty. Washington didn't like anything that sounded as if he were a king. In the end, he decided Mr. President would just do fine. The job of president is still in many ways what George Washington first made of it. The president is in charge of a foreign policy. That means how the United States deals with other countries. The president presents a budget to Congress, asking for money to run the government. The president is commander-in-chief of the army. The president chooses a cabinet, people to advise him on important issues. The president also appoints judges, including judges on the Supreme Court, who serves for life. When a Supreme Court judge dies, resigns, or retires, a new one is then appointed. When his first four-year term was over in 1793, Washington was ready to retire. He was in his 60s. His hair had turned white. His teeth hurt worse than ever. Recently, he'd come down with pneumonia. But the country was still so new and frail. Thomas Jefferson and others wanted Washington to stay on for another 4 years. The United States would be a little older then, and stronger. When the electors cast their votes again, Washington won, and again John Adams came in second. Washington's second term as president was an unhappy one, almost right from the start. There was a short-lived rebellion of farmers. They rose up because they didn't want to pay certain taxes on corn. Washington also agreed to a new treaty with the British. It made him very unpopular, but he wanted to avoid another war with the British while the country was still going through growing pains. One newspaper went so far to call Washington a fake patriot, a hypocrite. The personal insult hurt him greatly. The only part of his job that Washington took pleasure was in planning the new capital. First he had been a capital in New York, then Philadelphia. This one would be permanent, not far from Mount Vernon. It was called Washington City. He saw the building of the new president's house. Sadly, he is the only president who never got to live in the White House. By the time his second term as president was nearly over, Washington was bound and determined to leave government. He wrote a farewell address, printed in newspaper across the country. He thought 2 terms was long enough to serve as president. It was important to hand over power to the next president. That's what happens in a republic. King George III had once said that if Washington chose to give up power, he'd be the greatest man on earth. That's exactly what he did. For the third and last time, he retired. Sadly, he didn't enjoy the peace of Mount Vernon for very long. December 12, 1799 was a cold, rainy day. As usual, Washington came home after many hours of farm work. He didn't bother to change his wet clothes before dinner. 2 days later, he developed a bad throat infection. "I find myself going," he whispered to Martha. Then, after taking his own pulse, George Washington died. He was 67 years old. Martha insisted on a simple funeral and burial at Mount Vernon. However, across the country, there were tributes to George Washington. People felt a terrible loss. It almost seemed impossible to think of a young United States without George Washington. Right away, Congress began talking of building a monument to him. No building in Washington, D.C. can be taller than the Washington Monument, which was finished in 1880. And a national holiday in February celebrates George Washington's birthday. The faces carved on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota were the work of Gutzon Berglund and took 14 years to complete. George Washington is so famous that sometimes he seems more like a monument than a flesh and blood man. We think of him as the face on $1 bills and quarters. Yet, he was a human as anybody. He lived through amazing times and left his mark on our country in a way that no one else has. Perhaps the best tribute came from another signer of the Declaration of Independence, Harry Lee, who praised the memory of the man, first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. And that is it. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.